Hello. Welcome back to, what are we at? Webinar 9. Gosh, thank you again for joining us on this journey where we're trying to build some practical optimism in the international education sector. And every week, Rob Lawrence and I take a deep dive into different parts of the sector and really try and keep the conversation going. So, really appreciate you coming back. Really popular webinar. This one was over 350 registrations. We're really happy to do this. My name is James Martin. I am the Managing Director at Insider Guides. We prepare, welcome and support international students through a range of content outputs through print and online. And just today we launched a content production service to help institutions and organizations create content, student-driven content, things like that. So if that's of interest, please do reach out. If you have missed past webinars, you can head to insiderguides.com.au /webinars. Everything is there, as well as a link to next week's webinar where we have Professor David Lloyd, who is the Vice Chancellor of UniSA. I want to thank Rob Lawrence for joining us here today. He needs no introduction, but he's kindly joining this journey with us here. And thank you so much for joining us again, Rob.
Pleasure, great pleasure.
Right. Well, the future of partnerships. This is interesting. So, as COVID has affected institutions here in Australia, it is worth remembering they have also affected partner institutions across the world and how students use them. And many of these institutions close their doors, stemming the flow of students into Australia and all around the world for that matter. And it's one thing to manage a closed campus in Australia, but in other countries, that's a whole other game. So what happens now? Do we try to minimize the impacts or work with the disruption? How do you do that? How will students' expectations change over time? Will the rise of online learning play havoc with business models? To discuss this in greater detail, I'd like to welcome Steve Berridge to the webinar. Steve is the Senior Vice President of Future Students and International at Victoria University. Steve is an international specialist with over 20 years experience gained through leadership in international education in the UK and Australia. His role at Victoria University includes leading the institution's broad global engagement strategy and operation, including a number of established transnational education partnerships. Steve, thanks for joining us today.
Thanks, James. Pleasure to be here.
Great. Well, let's get started. I mean, I want to just say some housekeeping. At the end of this webinar, you will receive a survey. Please feel free to give us all the feedback that you can. We're always trying to improve these. There's a poll we'll launch midway through this webinar. We've got some interesting questions we'd love to hear from you from. And all these webinars are recorded and they're available on our website and on the YouTube channel, which we'll link to in the chat. Steve, we've got some interesting questions to get going with. We've got some really fascinating topics to cover, but Rob, why don't you kick us off?
Yeah, Steve, welcome. Thank you for making your time available today. It's really very kind of you, and there's a lot of everyone can learn from you. Steve, we've all seen the impact of all the events at home. We've seen it in our workplaces, we've seen it through conversations, media reports and everything. However, because of travel restrictions, we have not necessarily witnessed the full impact upon partner institutions abroad. We can guess, but many are doing it tough, I'm sure, and they maybe have fewer, or probably have fewer proper resources and mechanisms which they can help their sustainability. So what have you heard about the impact of recent events on offshore partners, and how are they addressing the challenges they're facing?
Well, thanks, Rob, and I should also say hello to everybody else who has found time to tune in, and I hope you're all going as well as you can do in what are fairly interesting and challenging times, particularly in our sector. And I feel that we are on the sharp end, or one of the sharp ends, if you like, of COVID-19. And it is incumbent on all of us to reflect on these sorts of things. So answering the question, Rob, I think my starting point with this is that, partnerships in general in international ed are really the engine the engine that drive international engagement. And my view's always been that, partners include all kinds of organisations, government agencies, agents, and education institutions. Okay, and so they really kind of run through, certainly in my experience, all aspects of an international engagement strategy. Now, specifically around education partner institutions, and in James's introduction, he mentioned that in my role, we look after a lot of transnational education partners. Well, what I would say for those partners, in fact, all the partners that I mentioned earlier, everybody's facing, I think, the same challenge that we're facing here in Australia. And fundamentally, that's a business continuity challenge. How do we operate right now, in the here and now? How do we sustain the activity to deliver the core activity, the core business of an education institution around teaching, learning, and research? Partner institutions, James mentioned, are closed around the world. Every one of Victoria University's transnational education partners, and we've got quite a few, are all closed to students. So everybody's facing that challenge around how you transition at scale and at speed to remote learning when you've got varying degrees of capability, capacity, infrastructure, and the rest of it to be able to do that. And I know that many people who are watching and listening will have been going through that in their own organisations. And that's contextual to the different education institutions in different jurisdictions in different countries. But it's remarkably common, I think, in terms of what institutions have experienced. And that's obviously had a kind of impact on the partnerships, in themselves, and presented a number of risks, I guess, to the partnerships through the partner's own challenges. And some of those are obviously operational. How do you manage a partnership? Which those of you who are involved in partnerships know they're pretty difficult at the best of times. They can be challenging. There's lots of problem solving. They're sort of endlessly fascinating, but you're working across two very different systems quite often. And so to throw in this kind of disruption makes the operation very challenging. That can have throw-on effects to the financial viability. We're seeing that a little bit across the sector. And in some cases, and I'm happy to report in the institution I work at, that's not the case. They are existential for some partnerships. Most partnerships are with established education institutions who've got a big domestic operation, but some are not. Some are very specialised, small, private organisations, which this is their main activity. This is their main cash flow. And so I think that presents some real challenges. But I think the majority of education partnerships, particularly in the transnational education space, are with universities, colleges, institutions, schools, etc., that this is a part of their activity, so they can kind of mitigate that a little bit. So that's the kind of threats that I'm seeing, if you like, or what's happening on the ground. And you didn't ask me this, Rob, but as I've known you for a long time, and you don't have to ask me for you to answer something, I think in terms of the mitigations which we can put in place as partners and our partners can put in place, it kind of goes back to basics, right? Around close cooperation. It really tests the depth and breadth of a partnership when you face challenges, and it's sort of communication. And some of the challenges are kind of, we've not experienced them before. To put, a Australian university program into fully remote learning mode in China, there's a regulatory whole context there that's required as well. So there's a lot of complexity and uncertainty. But there's also quite a bit of a camaraderie, I guess, and that's coming through the international education community more generally around the world. Everybody's facing the same challenges, to a greater or lesser degree.
Steve, just pick up on those challenges because, I'm trying to also think about where we might have challenges in the future, the obvious ones we know about. But let's just take, for example, do you think there's a risk that, a strange old risk, that a backlog may be starting to build because many partners do not have the capabilities, the resources to fully transition online? There are obvious differences. Not everyone wants to, so people may have deferred or studies are being suspended. So at the end of it all, you know, when classrooms return, do you think we might see a year from now or 18 months from now, you'll have a combination of students who've gone in an offshore partnership, who've deferred or suspended, they've returned, they've joined the commencements, and suddenly there could potentially be, theoretically, an influx which results in a higher than normal cohort, maybe starting from 18 months from now?
Yeah. Rob, I love your optimism, and you can join our planning meetings anytime. Look, I think the honest answer here is we don't know, obviously, but I think there is a plausible scenario where, and some of the global research, you know, that's come out recently from IDP and from QS around students looking for, you know, study to go offshore to study in destinations like Australia would prefer to defer. That actually translates to the domestic context as well. So there is a plausible scenario there that there'll be some kind of pent-up demand, that when that can be released in whatever way, shape or form, there will be a kind of uptick and a wave that comes through. And I think that's one of the challenges that we face in our partnerships, is planning for that. And it also depends on the partnership. Obviously, all of this is contextual. But if you think back to China examples again, where you might have a transnational education program with quota students, you know, so tightly sort of regulated the numbers by the Chinese university and the Chinese Ministry of Education behind that. And then you might have a bunch of students who would normally transfer offshore to the foreign institution who haven't gone there. So they now are occupying, you know, capacity in the partner institution, which then doesn't allow actually for that pent up or for that local demand to even enter the system till further down the track. But I think it is a plausible scenario that offshore we will have a flow through and a benefit, you know, in the future. Just a question of when and how much is really difficult to predict, obviously.
Yeah, I think the next point is affordability, and if it's you know, if the same demand will be there to pay for it. Before I ask you this next question, I wouldn't mind just showing you a clip here. This is a professor of marketing at NYU speaking on CNN last week.
So you think of another product that charges over $100,000 that gets 90 plus points of gross margin. Other than a pharmaceutical for a rare cancer, there's no product in the world, not Hermes, not Ferrari, not Apple, that gets these sorts of extraordinary margins for a product that largely hasn't changed in 5 decades. So quite frankly, we have this coming.
With that in mind, I mean, just from the context of the T&E and the partnership program, we know, for example, that you know, there's a 2+1, a 3+0. Sometimes that actually may compromise the ability to benefit from post-study work rights and regional migration points and things like that. But with, you know, economies going around the world going into recession, affordability is certainly now bubbling up as a greater concern. How do you feel about the affordability of studying abroad in general and the role of partnerships in that?
Yeah. By the way, I love your CNN quote. That's a TV clip there. I'm not sure we'd agree in Australia that there's 90% gross margin, but anyway, I take his point. Look, I think you've got to go back to drivers of demand here before we start talking specifically around pricing and affordability. And one thing I think we tend to do quite often in international education is generalize about what is an incredibly diverse student base, you know, and we're talking about the student segment, but, you know, and there's lots of different drivers of demand, but price is obviously one of them, and price points, willingness to pay are obviously critical. And at a macro level, I think various studies over the years have drawn the link between, you know, at a national level, economic growth and international demand, you know, as a sort of, you know, as a driver of international demand. And affordability has always been an issue for the vast majority of the population around the world who are seeking a high quality education and don't have access to it in their home country. So I think this is not a new issue. I guess your question is about, has this exacerbated, you know, that particular issue? And even the students that, you know, traditionally have made it into you know, either transnational programs or, you know, gone to a traditional offshore location like Australia or Canada or the US or the UK, you know, I think clearly affordability is an issue even for those students that are here. And that's been really borne out in the current circumstances where, you know, contrary to some of the popular belief that I've heard around the traps around international students, you know, having plenty of money and the rest of it, you know, it's obvious that a huge swathe of the population of international students in Australia are struggling, you know, and you can see that, and it's getting, thankfully, a little bit more coverage now, but not that much more help from our federal government. But, you know, I think a global recession is the key thing, which is obviously coming on the back of COVID-19. It will dampen demand across the board, and that manifests itself in a less, you know, a lower willingness to pay. So I think the short answer, you know, I've done a long answer, but the short answer to your question is, I do think that affordability is just heightened again around COVID. There may be an upside again for, you know, non-traditional models of education delivery, whether they are sort of T&E models at a lower price point, or whether they're new and emerging models like, you know, online learning and micro learning and the rest of it. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, there's also has to be an appetite to lower the fees from an institution's perspective, right?
There does, and you know, I think that's kind of an interesting point because certainly, again, you know, we generalise, but we talk about the Australian context. We've had, you know, we've had a couple of blips, but let's face it, we've had, you know, 30 years of pretty much unprecedented stellar growth, to the point where, you know, it gets baked into government sort of aspirations and even expectations and even budgets and providers' budgets, particularly universities, but other sectors as well. And costs are accrued according to those budgets. And there isn't a lot of history, certainly in the university sector where I am, of an appetite, I guess, for long-term, I suppose, price reductions in the international space. I mean, you've got to remember that most of universities, or a lot of universities in Australia, offers are price regulated to their domestic students at the undergraduate level and some at postgraduate level as well. So it's kind of new territory. And you know, although there are, if you like, pricing initiatives around student recruitment, which might be scholarships or discounts or those sorts of things, and they may well become more prevalent, right, over this period as competition hots up. Yeah, the idea that we actually might, you know, going back to your CNN news clip, you might say, right, well, there's a lot of fat in that. You could reduce price and maintain market, you know, market share and the rest of it. Yeah, my personal view is I don't think there's appetite for that, but you know, I might be wrong in a few months.
Right. Well, I know Rob has a question later on about pricing in more detail, but in terms of an opportunity from this, I mean, we're looking at TAFEs. Could there be an opportunity for TAFEs to elevate their profile as a viable partner? You know, whether independently or in conjunction with offshore partners or in collaboration with one or more Australian university partners.
Yeah. Short answer: in theory, yes. In practice, lots of challenges. In my view, right? So, you know, talking about the opportunity side first, I think I'd probably highlight three things, you know, which would make you sort of think that there would be a yes answer to your question. And the first one is on the demand side. Obviously, skills development is in many ways the critical need in many countries in the world. You know, including in the major kind of source countries and some of the biggest economies in the world. Those of us who've worked in India a fair bit will be very familiar with the 500 million, you know, Indian number that is often touted around that needs skills development, the demographic dividend, this just looks like a huge opportunity, right, on the demand side, and that's reflected in other countries and other places. The second sort of thing on the opportunity side is, Australia has a world-class vocational education system, right? Although it's taken a bit of a battering in recent years, it does have public TAFE, it's got dual sector universities, and it's got a pretty resilient, although again, that's been through a few ups and downs, private sector as well, right? So we've got some capability there. And then the third thing, I guess, is that you would think there is an opportunity, is this sort of boundaries between higher education and vocational education are slowly, and probably this will accelerate, kind of coming down, right? And the sort of distinction between traditional degree courses and other sorts of tertiary education, I think, will become less relevant over time, and we're well positioned for that. That's all on the opportunity side. But I think on the, why I said in theory, but there are significant challenges. I think in a lot of those sort of source countries and countries of engagement, perceptions of vocational education, by potential students and policymakers even, and others are not particularly highly valued. So that's a kind of barrier that sort of feeds into sort of business model considerations around what partners and individuals are prepared to pay for in terms of engagement with the vocational sector around the sorts of things that we could and have done over the years. And then you throw in a few other things as well, like compliance and regulatory frameworks. What appears and actually is a huge opportunity is actually quite challenging to capture, and that doesn't mean that it shouldn't be pursued. But I think if you think of it from an Australian context, all of those institutions I mentioned earlier, of course, are all battling with significant, COVID-19 disruption themselves. And so, how well positioned are they to sort of address that opportunity? And probably one sort of big picture thing I would say, or one overarching comment I would say around all sectors, in terms of education, whether it's schools, English language, or the vocational or the higher ed sector, is from a kind of national point of view, this idea around, from the Australian context, Team Australia, a proposition which is very joined up, I think, is really important. And I know that our agencies like Austrade, and I think you had Rebecca Hall on, I think, from Austrade at some point. These are kind of really important, right? That even though we have to navigate as individual institutions, this line between competition and collaboration with our immediate kind of peers within the sectors we operate in. When we go outside, that is not a good look if we're all sort of, competing and going out individually. And I think that's a real sort of tension, by the way, in the system we have here. But it's partly how I think the vocational sector and other sectors can, potentially collaborate together to get a kind of win-win across the board. Easier said than done.
Yeah, well, I wouldn't mind moving to the short-term future now. Rob, why don't you jump in?
Yeah, Steve, I'm just going to make a very, very quick comment there as well, because I totally agree with you about navigating a way through. And we're going to have roadmaps for different countries, because they're going to be at different stages of post-COVID response as well. So it's going to add a further layer of complexity, I think. But Steve, the question which I've had at the back of my mind for a while, and again, talking on the basis of partnerships, some universities and institutions have become heavily dependent upon partners since they provide a level of certainty around numbers, the group cohorts, and students who articulate through partners are ultimately also less expensive to recruit per capita, because often they're making a single or maybe one or two options, and often it's been filtered or managed through the partner. Other institutions are more reliant upon retail, particularly those institutions with strong brand traction. And, there's all kinds of things that go on there. It's a more expensive group because students make multiple applications. There's a greater use of agents in that process, etc. So I've generally seen as a view that I've always said, maybe 40% wholesale, meaning the group, meaning partners, and 60% retail, meaning focusing upon individual purchasers. Do you believe, and this is, I think, a really, really interesting question or balance to achieve, will that balance shift? And in what direction? Do you think we might see more wholesale or more retail, or do you think it might stay roughly the same as it is now?
Okay. So I think, firstly, lifting it up a level, the ideal international engagement profile for an institution, particularly university, is a balanced mix of activities across its strategy, full stop. Research, student staff mobility, T&E, recruitment onshore, and capacity building type work they might do with government. And with recruitment, you're dead right, you want to have a similar mixed portfolio to balance risk, onshore, offshore channels, source country, disciplines, study levels, the kind of retail, wholesale concept that you talk of, and those sort of recruitment partnerships, which you could also call the wholesale or the business to business, if you like, channel, most typically articulations, but there are also other types of partnerships, like study abroad, visiting student partnerships, or even scholarship partnerships with overseas governments who might be funding students to come and study with your institution. You're absolutely right that the cost of acquisition, to use that sort of salesy type phrase, is lower overall. But I think there's a big but in my mind, particularly in the current context, which is the timeline really for establishing these partnerships. And those viewers who are sort of in this space will know that, first of all, lots of them don't work, actually, despite what we might say, more generally. But these are complicated and they involve a lot of different things, and you've got to have quite a few in development to see which ones come off. But the key thing is the payoff is often years, right? Years. So they're not a short-term mitigation. So you might be right that we come out of this and there's more opportunity to work with partners to build new kinds of channels. But I actually think what you're probably going to see is a balance in favor of the direct student recruitment. And not only because of that kind of pressure on partnerships and the timescale it takes to establish new ones, but I also think it's about other sort of trends going on around access to information for students, and digital marketing and the sort of digitization more generally of the international education space. And so a scenario could be that the partner sort of channels, they're still important, and they'll still be developed and grown in the long run, but in the short run, it's about value propositions being presented directly to students, maybe still through recruitment agents, but not in that kind of managed cohort type of way. And you only have to think back to maybe 20 years ago, when lots of institutions were making sort of new partnerships with Chinese or Malaysian institutions, and there's other places as well. If you think about the access to information that those students had at that time, it was an absolute fraction of what those students have access to now. So it goes back to a broader point about partnerships, which is you got to be really clear about what value you are adding through the partnership, other than you're presenting a route to a student that they don't have any other choice, other than to take. So overall, I think probably that direct student channel. I mean, you know a lot about this yourself, Rob. I
actually agree with you wholeheartedly. It's a quicker impact. The costs may be higher, and obviously there's a far greater level of engagement needed through digital media, social media. It's going to be a long time until we're actually directly in market. Just have you got any thoughts about how that can be managed, just in terms of managing the costs or the level of investment that would be required?
What, in terms of building that direct to market channel? Well, look, I mean, I think, I think it's a kind of strategy decision, isn't it, for universities who at the moment are in a you know, in an absolute response mitigation phase around COVID and the seismic impact it's having on especially Australian institutions because of the high reliance on international revenue. But I do think that, you know, along with the short-term pain that is no doubt going to bring, the kind of longer term or medium term, I guess, kind of structural response around, well, what does our international operation look like? What size is it? And how do we kind of win in that space? I think it's a real strategy question, Rob. I'm not sure kind of, there might be some short-term plays around that in terms of, you know, it's now everybody's job to kind of recruit as many. I mean, John Maloney would have talked about this in one of your previous webinars, I think, around access to students and you know, and how really you're going to kind of ramp that up. But I think in the short term, it's really a strategy question. Sorry, medium term, it's really a strategy question for universities around and other providers around, you know, where they're going to put their dollars in the international space.
And John also made the point on that about how difficult some of the agents are having it as well, and we mustn't forget about those channels as well. Yeah. I've just many partners like engaged with other institutions in other countries, which have, you know, we see it in the media, have been more dramatically impacted by a combination of events, obviously COVID, but also now increasingly the protests. And immediately the UK comes to mind for both of you and I, I'm sure. How much do you think this will impact other countries? And will this result in an increase possibly in the number of students coming to Australia for a variety of reasons, Australia and New Zealand, or will a greater proportion of students, do you think, opt to stay at home?
Yeah, and you know why I'll never get a gig on CNN like that guy? Because I'll answer it with a question like, who knows, right? That wouldn't work, would it, in that kind of thing, right? So the answer is who knows, but I think it's certainly a plausible scenario and one that's playing out within government. I know for sure that, you know, is there an opportunity to position Australia as a kind of COVID safe destination, you know, in specific relation to key competitors like the US and the UK, and you know, that school of thought that we are actually relatively well positioned to become a preferred destination because of this. But again, I go back to my driver of demand sort of point around, look, you've got to have a lot of other things lined up as well as that. But I think it is a plausible scenario. I mean, it'd be interesting to see how it plays out in New Zealand now. I mean, the borders are not open in New Zealand yet, but obviously the restrictions are being relaxed, and presumably at some point borders will be opened. And, you know, will we see a sort of flow of students to New Zealand? You know, could we get that bubble going between New Zealand and Australia? Yeah, I think that's, again, you know, framing our thinking has to be this kind of opportunity and risk piece. And, you know, a lot of the last few weeks and months we've been spending managing risk, you know, in the immediate term, and then we get our heads up, you know, above the parapet for a little bit, can come up for air. These are the kind of things we've got to take really seriously. But, you know, it doesn't help when we get sort of other things coming in, like, you know, the Chinese Education Bureau warning that came out yesterday, and you know,
we actually have that on our poll. By the way, there is a poll. One of the questions is, do you think the recommendation by the Chinese Ministry of Education to be cautious about choosing to go to Australia will dramatically lower the numbers of Chinese students coming to Australia over the next 12 months? 49% think somewhat yes.
Yeah,
so 24% think absolutely yes. So yeah, it certainly is making an impact.
It doesn't help, does it? And then the other thing I think, which I think is concerning, well, certainly concerns me, and I know it's concerning others, is the risk we face around the message we are sending around the world about how we are supporting the international, however many 700,000 odd international students who are actually here, right, at this time. I mentioned them earlier, that a lot of them are doing it tough. And, you know, I think some of the messaging that we've put out there, you know, hasn't been that helpful around international students. And, you know, we need to learn, and we know this in the international partnership space, that this is a long-term, trust-based, reciprocity is important, reputation is important, and you can undo a lot of good work by perceptions that we are not looking after.
Yeah.
They're not all young people, but predominantly young people who've put their trust and resources into our hands, to help build their futures. So I think that's as critical as the kind of thing.
It is an interesting one. I might actually, there's two questions coming up here regarding schools and ELICOS. I might meld them into one, just because I think they're going to be, you will have interesting points on both. But really, it's about the pain that they're in right now. And we're talking about, making sure that everyone in the sector, especially the students, are somewhat well communicated to here in Australia. But we look at the sector itself. We've got schools where ELICOS that are being hit very hard, especially the ELICOS partners. I mean, what impact have you observed in regards to the schools and the ELICOS sector? And are there ways in which Australian institutions can provide some extra support here?
Yeah. So look, I'll comment first on ELICOS, on English language, and clearly, that sector in particular, is and there are other sectors and other providers. It is most badly hit because it's, if you think of the profile of a bigger institution, a school or a college, a TAFE or a uni, the international segment is only a part of their sort of operation. Now, could be a 700 million part of it, like if you're UNSW or someone like that, but you've got other stuff going on, right? Whereas when you're only in the business of international students, pretty much, then this is obviously seismic and particularly the standalone English language sector, I think, really challenging. For those English language, players that are within institutions, like in my university, we have one that's somewhat, supported by, again, the diversity and the scale of the organisation. But of course, they've had to do all those other things, and that the rest of the international aid sectors have done around transitioning to online, remote delivery, managing agents, and sharing the pain. And I think really at the end of the day, this goes back to my point, and it's the same point for the schools as well. When it's a kind of Team Australia response around how are we supporting the students that we already have within, these providers, but also what's our kind of support, what's our proposition, if you like, to our partners overseas when students can't travel here. Now that could be a remote learning offer, and that's what we really need to get, students flowing onshore in the future. But, it might just be other things like, engagement activities and, maintaining those links and that support for when we are able to reactivate, the activity. But it's very challenging, I think, and a joined up approach across the sectors, I just feel is really important and not easy.
Yeah, absolutely. Rob, do you want to move to question 9?
Yeah, sure. Yeah. Steve, a lot of what you're saying is actually talking about the whole changes in buyer behaviour, and I totally agree. I think we're going to see a complete change in the shape and composition of the student cohorts, and it's not just COVID, it's not just the protests, it's also the influence of other governments, it's all the question of affordability, access to loans, so many issues. So, just for a moment, if I think about it for one moment, with reference to students engaged in partnerships, the TME programs, mobility programs, how do you believe buyer behaviours, and by buyer behaviours, I'm thinking about things like attitudes, their perceptions, their values, their barriers, influencing factors, parental issues, etc. How do you think these buyer behaviours will change over the next few years?
Yeah, well, I think all of those partnerships, TNE and others, will remain kind of big opportunities, because at the end of the day, at a macro level, we've still got a a fairly chronic undersupply of quality education around the world, and a population, you know, that is not being adequately served by existing supply. So you've still got demand at the macro level. But I think at the micro level and even at the individual level, you know, a few things kind of stand out to me. I mean, what you would expect, I think, from partners and students is that there might be a greater appetite for new models, you know, new types of way of consuming what was, you know, previously a fairly traditional mode. Even most T&E models are pretty traditional, actually, right? So definitely more digital delivery, whether that's blended within existing models. I think that's probably the starting point. But also probably an openness to really non-traditional offers, especially fully online. You know, there's a few barriers there to overcome. So I think at the macro level, demand will still be there, but how that plays out in terms of an individual decision-making around a particular offer, I think is important. The affordability question, I think that came in earlier, directly relates to this question in terms of buyer behavior and where their preferences will lie. And, you know, again, highly complex, highly sort of segmented, you know, group, the international education students sector, you know, segments still wishing for the you know, in-country experience in somewhere like Australia. Another group, you know, very happy to have a fully, you know, a fully sort of comprehensive education experience in their own country through a high quality, you know, program. And then kind of everything in between, that idea of the spectrum, I think will remain, where you've got on one end the traditional get on a plane and, you know, spend 100 grand or whatever to go to Canada, versus the idea of a more cost-effective but quality proposition, right? But overall, I do think we'll probably see a greater appetite for different delivery model, and probably, you know, more, and you know, you would hypothesize that the market will provide, right? In that.
Well, I guess the question is, you know, what if they demand this? If they demand a completely different offering based on cost? So we're looking at, you know, if it's student experience plus education plus qualification divided by tuition, and that's the value, and then you take away some of this student experience because you can't go on campus as much. You know, you take away sort of the kind of education you're going to get because it's all, half of it's online, and you still get a qualification. Then it comes down to, well, yeah, maybe your buying behavior will, and it has to adapt, which then leads me into this next question. If that does adapt, how do you envisage, I guess, the partner programs changing the kinds of student cohorts which are coming out of these out of these organizations, and the size and the shape of them?
Yeah, I mean, they should be well positioned to adapt, but of course it depends on the type of partner program. Because if you go back to original strategy around why institutions enter partner programs, and as Rob kind of indicated earlier, sometimes it's around a recruitment channel. At the end of the day, it's around a sort of articulation program. But a lot of transnational education programs never have an articulation to another country. They're fully in-country delivery, and the whole purpose of, you know, the partner institution, say the Australian institution, going down that track is to access a market segment which they could not access through their traditional offer, which is about students getting on a plane and traveling to Australia, right? So there's a kind of, you know, you by partnering, you know, you access a lot of things, and one of the things you access is ability to reach, you know, that local market, I think, and so it becomes a question of how adaptable, as much as anything, not just you are, your organization here, but your partner is. And my opening comments to your question, response to your question, was about it depends on the partner, because some education partnerships are extremely restricted, you know, in certain jurisdictions, and they can't be agile enough to respond to those. But others are extremely responsive and are actually ahead of the game, and will be coming to the Australian provider and saying, we think there's an opportunity here, you know, and that's just great, because then we're well positioned, because it is very difficult for, you know, fairly resource-strapped, and that's going to get worse, Australian institutions to access niche emerging opportunities in different markets where they don't really have, you know, kind of boots on the ground in any kind of scale. And so I think partnerships can, if you get the right partnership, you can actually get yourselves positioned for that potential opportunity.
Yeah, I guess it's sort of a it's an equalizer in some respects, because it, you know, if you do sort of become a little bit more adaptive and turn a little bit more online and do use your partners effectively, then you can really sort of grow your base of students. But it just might be that price point has to come down to meet that demand and grow outwards. So that's not an easy one to.
No, it's not. And more generally, my personal view on this is, and the reason why I said that I still think that, well, I think that T&E is a massive opportunity, is that we've only really scratched the surface of it over the last 20 years. And we've kind of exported certain models, and, you know, that's been successful, but also quite challenging at times. And the real kind of opportunity is an innovation opportunity. And by saying that, what I mean is there's a kind of a conundrum that has to be addressed. And the conundrum goes back to my point earlier around, you know, 500 million apparently people in India who need skills development, right? And we've got a high quality system, and there's a group of people, a very large group of people around the world who would benefit from that system. Yet to date, it's been very difficult to come up with a model that solves the conundrum of how do you reconcile, you know, a high quality offer, and by that I mean something that we are proud to badge as, you know, our institutions and our government and our regulators to be up to the standards that we, you know, so kind of fiercely protect and are very proud of. So quality with a price point, to go to your affordability question, that actually works at scale and is reflective of the actual means of the population in any particular country, which are, you know, quite often developing countries, obviously, and have a lot lower median income than Australia, and then volume, right? And you know, getting the volume, cost, quality sort of triangle conundrum sorted out, I think is the innovation challenge. And you know, people are trying to solve that, but it's not easy because there's big barriers at every one of those points, I think. And
well, there's also the reaction from the institutions. Rob, you had a question about how they might react.
Yeah, I've been thinking about that. And Steve, the other thing I'm going to say to you about the partnerships are important, because if we can skip a generation with the pedagogical models, that'll open up more markets where people might not have a strong connections here, which is a big part of the retail segment. But if affordability becomes an issue, what is always a risk that partners may start using scholarships, loyalty discounts, other funding measures to quickly re-engage with the market. And could this potentially feed into expectations, do you think, about what students at partner institutions coming here may expect from Australian institutions, possibly forcing tuition fees down, subsidies up? Could it even drag our proposition down?
Yeah, I think that's right. And you know, we touched on this a few minutes ago around affordability and pricing. I think that's where you're really getting at is that it is, you know, that's part of the triangle, which is around cost and price. You know, if you're trying to reduce your price to such a degree that you can have an at scale participation, then what does that do to your quality and your and you know, and particularly if you've got flows of students going from, you know, transnationally going from an offshore program to an onshore program, you know, does that in the long term, you know, start to put downward pressure on you know, on prices, or at least, you know, it's certainly in the university sector. I know it's not true of all segments in the Australian international ed space, but the concept of kind of differential pricing is quite problematic, you know, for many universities. That, you know, we've got one fee, And we might do a few scholarships or the odd bit of discount, but fundamentally, you know, doesn't matter where you're from or what your circumstances are. This is the fee, you know, sort of onshore. So I think so. But Rob, I mean, I think I said this earlier on. From a university perspective, I wouldn't underestimate, you know, the kind of resistance to that. but based on, not just based on current kind of, you know, budget pressures, which are pretty significant, but also just this this kind of never-ending kind of march of success, you know, so-called success in attracting large numbers of students whilst sustaining pretty high, you know, price rises, you know, over a long period of time. So I don't know if that really answers the question, but anyway.
Well, I mean, it could also work in your favor. I mean, we could have a situation where there's an evolution of online partners only. And then, you know, once they finish the online partnership, they could then move to Australia and things like that.
Yeah. Yeah. No, look, I do think that that's a real possibility, right? That the digitalization of kind of education is really going to disrupt in the kind of medium term. You know, we've had a pretty resilient model for a long time around a face-to-face model in most of our organisations, but in the medium term, I think that's going to really come under pressure. And there's all sorts of ways that might play out, whether it's, you know, a fully online provider really nailing that big sort of global opportunity for low cost, high quality, you know, proposition, or whether it's kind of blended models where students really spend, you know, 1-2 years somewhere else, and then because they, you know, really want to get the Australian or the British or the Canadian experience or wherever it is, they do have that kind of 2 destination experience, which reduces their cost. And those sorts of things do exist to a degree, but not at scale, I don't think.
Well, I mean, the appetite to study abroad is still there. I mean, the student experience and just the experience of, I mean, from that IDP survey they did a while ago, IDP Connect one, they, you know, one of the results is that they ask, there's a real pent up demand, and this Rob has alluded to over the previous sessions, there's this sort of sense that these decisions are made over a long period of time. They're not quick. You know, and a large part of that is just to get to another country to experience what life is. Rob, do you have anything to add on that?
Yeah, absolutely right. You're spot on there. They do want the life experience. They do want travel, and often we mustn't forget the influence of a family here, past visits, desirability of place. That, you know, we have got in Australia and in New Zealand with the very, very strong mixed propositions.
Yeah.
Do you want me to go on with another question? Because I've just.
Well, before you jump onto that question, I thought I'd play another little clip from that same interview that just gets people might just get you thinking. We'll go from here.
Opportunity, I guess these tech companies do. Is that right?
100%. If you're Apple or Amazon or Google, you have this implicit agreement with the marketplace. So your stock's going to double in 5 years. 5 years. Otherwise, people will buy stock in Netflix or Salesforce. And in order to do that, Apple has to increase their top line revenue by about $150 billion over the next 5 years, which limits the number of industries. They have to go big game hunting, and that literally limits them to government, defense, the auto industry, which is a low margin business, and they will immediately zero in on 2, as they already are, healthcare and education. So big tech is about to come into education, not because they want to, but because they have to.
Right. Well, that's an interesting start to this question for Rob.
Yeah, these corporates are circling. And a few weeks ago, I made reference to the likes of HSBC and ANZ Bank may actually become agents, since they not only have the resources to build the capability, but it's also a way of securing new long-term customers. So I kept thinking about this, Steve, in the last couple of weeks. Taking that thought even further, do you believe that greater corporatization may occur with the likes of, let's say, HSBC and ANZ, this world actually creating their own branded partnership institutions, which universities and institutions are going to have to work with?
Look, I think this is a great question, and I think it does depend on the jurisdiction. There's a very Australian context to this versus, say, US or elsewhere. There's no doubt that institutions are compelled to, need to, and absolutely, should increase their engagement themselves with industry, with corporates, etc. And lots of universities are actually quite strong in that space, but it is a mixed bag. Do I think that these sort of big players, whether they're big tech, in particular, will, I think the sort of disruption term is, disintermediate universities? They'll sort of cut universities' lunch and other providers' lunch and TAFEs and schools and whatever else it is. I think the answer is it's possible, and that one of the things we always have to guard against is not that we lack skill and knowledge; it's that we lack relevance. Right? That's the kind of biggest risk, I think, for institutions.
That's it. That's interesting.
Yeah, but I wouldn't. I mean, I think that's the kind of innovation risk in general, by the way, for incumbents, is that, it's your relevance. You've got to stay relevant. But I wouldn't overplay this risk, actually, Rob, personally. And the reason for that, I think, is, and before I go on to that point, I'll just say we have seen a bit of this already. We've seen a bunch of kind of global companies come out in the last 5 years or so, or 3 or 4 years, and said, oh, you know what, we don't need university degrees anymore. Just apply directly to us. We'll train you up in how we want you to operate, because we don't think we're getting the right quality. So this is a big kind of topic within education more generally. But I wouldn't underestimate, certainly in the Australian context, the fact that our universities, mainly, and our TAFEs, these are public institutions with kind of missions. They're purpose-based. They don't just exist to, meet student demand and, turn a profit. I mean, we hope that we turn a profit we're not-for-profit organisations, but we have to be viable. So I think our institutions provide a lot of value across the board, right? And that has to be recognised. And that this is a highly regulated sector, highly regulated. So it's not that easy, actually, for this to happen in the short term. In the medium to long term, yeah, it could happen. And that would happen by universities losing relevance, and there being such and TAFEs in colleges losing relevance. There being such a kind of clamour around the skills gap between what our education system is producing and what is required in the workforce, that some sort of political will gets formed to do something about it. I wouldn't put it out of the question. But I think the mitigations, again, are around institutions, taking their role very seriously in around their connectivity with industry and workforces of the future, while recognising that even, take out COVID-19 for a minute, this kind of questions and discussions around disruption of education have been going strong for 5 or 6 years now. But, the education model that we've got, which is 1,000 years old or whatever, he said 50 years old, it's about 1,000 years old, been pretty resilient.
Just before the dot-com crisis, Steve, Cisco was circling to create their own university in East Asia.
Yeah. And I mean, they do exist. There are corporate universities. I mean, they've got them in the States, and there's various flavors of them. And it's up to us to make sure that we as educationalists stay relevant and make sure that we're delivering value to students and to partners, and taxpayers, and everybody else.
Yeah, it's an interesting one. I was thinking about the kind of partnership with a big tech giant like Apple. And you can imagine a student does a partner program to do some theory in Singapore for a while, then comes to UniSA in a course sort of partly funded by Apple to learn design, and then do an internship online with Apple. And there's just all these possibilities of a big tech company actually adding value to a university degree. And, and there may be, as we saw in that clip, that it may be that universities are forced into this position anyway.
Yeah, no, it's
interesting. Well, we've got a question here. We've got, I'd like to ask you this question. An anonymous attendee: if a program ends up being 50% online do you think PSW restrictions will be reviewed? Many students are currently more confident about Australia because they have a perception, many students are currently more confident about Australia because they have a perception of just a max of 2 modules being online offshore due to PSW restrictions. Yeah. What would you say to that?
Yeah, look, I think the policy settings around student visas, post-study work rights, and even migration settings more generally are a critical driver of demand, right? Going back to my hobby horse of drivers of demand, they have big consequences when we change them. And in my time in Australia, which isn't that long, nearly 10 years, you've seen them change a fair bit, and they've had almost immediate responses. So I think this connection between students who are offshore and students who are onshore, is really coming into sharp focus at the moment with, students quite concerned who can't come onshore to Australia, who were due to and missing out on post-study work rights. So I think, it's a question for government, of course, but from the sector point of view, I think, certainly my view anyway, is that providing a really clear and attractive offer to students more generally around the pathways, for them to gain work experience and potential migration more generally later on, I think is absolutely critical. And as part of COVID-19, I know that the various government agencies are doing their best to respond to those kind of issues which are emerging. But there's no doubt we need a really strong post-study work offer. And I think the UK came out and announced at the end of last year they were going to sort of reinstate theirs after a few years. It drives demand, so we need it, right? And also we've got skilled migrants, and we've got a perfect pool of well-educated, individuals who are attuned to the Australian experience, whether they've done an offshore program or whether they've spent time in Adelaide or Sydney or Rockhampton or wherever. It's just pure gold, right, for the country, it seems to me. So,
Rob, you're a bit of an expert when it comes to these sorts of regulatory settings and trying to get it all right. What would you say to this?
We can't risk change. We might have to adapt short term some of the models, and they might have to change the regulatory environment just to allow for a certain amount of participation in the digital space. I think the settings will have to go back to what they were eventually when it's safe to study here full time. Yeah. We might see a different proposition in the way we deliver courses and programs, but ultimately it is a major return on investment for students from so many countries, and use them, and we just will be backpedaling for years.
Yeah, we just had a question here from Paulina, just came in. Paulina Bravo, from your point of view, the student visa conditions should be linked to conditions for the providers, meaning many agreements from providers never considered compelling circumstances such as pandemic. Therefore, many students couldn't fight for a refund after withdrawing from their courses. This is difficult because both providers and agents also have their estimated income linked to the fact that students are committed to complete their courses. It's a very tricky and grey area that needs to be reviewed. I'm not sure if that is a question, but yeah, any thoughts on that, Steve?
No, it sounds like a comment to me and a pretty reasonable one. And I think it just throws into the spotlight again how a set of pretty well considered, policy settings, when the circumstances change, they don't work, right? Always. And as Rob said, I think, there need to be some short-term mitigations against that. Right, to reflect that.
Yeah. Well, we've got a question I'd love to ask you. I mean, there's so many factors. We've talked about tech, affordability, potential fallouts from China. Well, we haven't talked about that too much, but we have got some interesting poll results here, which are now live for everyone to see. I'll just go through them really quick. How do you believe the TNE partnerships will be impacted next year? The winner is 43%, more students studying for longer back home. Well, there you go. That's touches on what we were talking about pretty closely. The second question is that people believe that the greatest decline in student numbers will come from China. 53% believe it will come from China. The nearest one is the USA, 30% after that. So it's really quite a big consensus that most people think China will be the biggest one to fall. the news this week that the Chinese Ministry of Education said to be cautious about choosing to go to Australia. Will that dramatically lower the number of students coming to Australia? 53% said, yeah, somewhat. So I think there's a consensus that it will have an impact. And do you think students will come to Australia if they know that 50% of their course will be, this is theoretical, online due to social distancing measures or on-campus restrictions? They said not really. I mean, I don't think... yeah, it sounds like, and it's close. So yes and no, a split on that one, around in the mid-30s. So they're not sure if they're going to come or not if they know that their experience is going to be different. I think that's going to be an interesting tussle of thought over the next 6, 12, 18 months. How do you position yourself as a great place to study and live if living and studying doesn't look the same as last year? That's really sort of what we're coming into. And so we're looking at all these factors now. What do you think is going to happen? If we had a crystal ball, we're looking at partnerships, onshore, offshore, in-country, everywhere, online. How would you sort of paint the next 3 years? Go on, just give me a few minutes.
I should definitely get a gig on CNN, right? If I can get that one right. No, yeah, look, let's keep it simple. In the short term, obviously, it's all about a COVID response. It's about sustaining partnerships. It's about business continuity. It's about people doing the hard yards to look after students, look after partners, whoever they are, whether they're T&E partners, agents, whoever they are. Right? I think that will dominate this year. It'll be a domestic agenda around providers and the challenges that they face, and it'll be about what levers are there to pull in the policy space and how can the sector kind of influence that. I think that's probably the short term, and we're going to take a lot of pain. We know that most institutions and the economy and the country as a whole and countries around the world are going to take a hit. So in the longer term, let's flip to that. I think, which could be the end of your 3-year period. Really, there's a couple of things I think we need to consider. I mean, and we talked about this earlier. Demand, I think, at a macro level stays strong. There's a demand for high quality education. We've seen actually from recessions around the world in various places actually that education remains even more important, right, in terms of recovery. So that stays there. And digital acceleration will happen, I think, and will disrupt. We talked about that. And I think that presents probably again some opportunities and risks. And the opportunity side is that I think the addressable market will potentially become much larger, right? It's already huge, actually. And people like the OECD, organizations like the OECD, have a go at scaling that occasionally, putting it in the millions. And then that will become larger because students will have access to study in many new ways, right, through the digitization of education. But obviously coming with that, the competitive space will become much more intense, right? Both from traditional players like 100-year-old universities and schools and whatnot, but also from new entrants, which include actually the big global industry corporates, tech giants, right? That is there. We cannot just ignore that. And so what do you do about it? I think as an institution, well, I think you've got to provider. You've got to focus on this kind of core competence, right, that you've got as an educator. I mentioned earlier, a lot of us work in the public space, in public organisations. Not all of us, and we've got a kind of mission-based reason for being. We've got to navigate that tension I mentioned earlier between the collaborate, compete to get some sort of, consistent offer out there. Right, which I think we sometimes struggle with, and we all, I think, need to focus on understanding the purpose of our international engagement as providers, individual providers, but also as a sector, and be really kind of honest with ourselves about why we do it, what we're trying to deliver, and what value are we trying to create for first and foremost the students and the partners and the individuals that we are engaging with internationally, but also more broadly, what value we're trying to create for our organisations and for our societies and for for our own nations, I think. And that sort of honesty needs to be there, I think. And you know, so when you ask the question, where we're going to be at in 3 years' time, look, you know, we're going to be in a more competitive space. We're still going to be recovering, I think, from COVID for sure. Are we going to be back to a kind of double-digit growth scenario for Australia? Maybe, right? If we get that kind of pent-up demand being released in the way that Rob talked about for TNE earlier, you get that in the domestic market, and yeah, it could be huge. But I think if we can get anything out of this crisis, it has to be to really focus on some of these risks and opportunities for the long term. And the kind of international ed partnership and the TNE in particular has got to be part of that mix, I think. But you'd like to think in 3 years' time we'll be in a relatively strong position.
Yeah. Rob, what do you think?
Well, across the world, education is arguably one of the highest value-based purchases. A degree's the ticket, you could say. And so the question there is, if the degree's the ticket, what if you choose the wrong destination? So in one sense, there's a little bit of assurance about Australia, you know, Steve's point about COVID safe or higher COVID safe level. And, you know, if we get it right, and if we can provide opportunities for the return on investment, which people look for, which is all about employment, it's all about, you know, it's about the opportunity to live here, to enjoy here. I think you'll still find that high values-based purchase is there. You've got those who you've got segments within segments there. You've got the rite of passage group, and you've got all the way through to those looking for change in their life and their opportunities. So I think education demand will continue to exponentially grow. And what we've got to do is make sure we're front and central for capturing that growth.
Steve Berridge, thank you very much.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Steve.
It was a fantastic session. I'm really interested to hear your comments in the feedback form on this. And please, we'll be doing this the same time next week with Professor David Lloyd, for the Vice Chancellor of UniSA, where we're going to even double down on disruption. We're going to unpack it and look at it all different ways. Yeah, we're basically going to ask some really Rob's going to help us to develop some really interesting questions, and be really interesting to hear a Vice Chancellor as well tell how they view the future of international education and education in general post COVID-19. Remember, all these webinars are recorded on insiderguides.com.au/webinars. And please, you know, we are Insider Guides. We do a lot of international student content. And so please, if any of your international students are struggling through this time, please push them towards insiderguides.com.au. We've got a whole team working on good quality content to help students get through this. And please, I look forward to seeing you all next week. And so yes, thank you so much. See you, everybody.
Thank you.
Bye. Bye.